Good evening, I'm Stephen Cummings, and welcome again to yet another edition of the Citizens Community Forum. And as per usual, our objective is always to have an engaging and interactive as well as a civil discourse. In so doing, help develop a culture of peace and understanding through constructive dialogue and, yes, citizens' participation. Our guests are persons who express views and opinions as well as perspectives of their own, and sometimes may not necessarily be that of the FBN network, the Citizens Community Forum, or that of the host. Our topics are also wide-ranging. Discussions at times may be emotionally charged, but surely we can always find common ground and learn from each other, irrespective of differing views. Now, on December 6th, we saw what can be described as a political vortex which swung and spun the way of a new political administration in terms of the direction for the Tobago House of Assembly. And perhaps this was not the first time in that the island had two elections in just 1 year, the last being an increase from 12 electoral seats to 15 seats, coming out of a 6-6 political deadlock on January 25th between a newly formed Progressive Democratic Patriots, the PDP, and of course, the PNM, Tobago Island Council. Many saw this as a constitutional crisis needing the intervention of the Parliament in passing an Amendment Act in March of 2021. Allowing the Election and Boundaries Commission, the EBC, the mandate to increase the number of seats on the island. Now, a 51,382 strong electorate had to decide which way the political scale should be tipped, whether to continue the status quo or to decide on a new trajectory, and that they did on December 6th. The race to the THA saw 5 political parties at the starting block, but at the end saw 14 seats going to the PDP and 1 for the PNM, the People's National Movement, Tobago Island Council, also ending 21 consecutive years of PNM control over the Assembly. Well, our topic this evening inside the Citizens Community Forum, Future of Tobago, Implications for the Twin Island State following December 6 election results. And to help us discuss the issues, I have with me a former government senator and political analyst and leader of the Movement for Social Justice, David Abdullah. David, good evening to you once again, and let me just say welcome again to the Citizens Community Forum.
Good evening, Stephen, and thank you very much for having me on your Citizens Community Forum. Good to be on your station.
Yeah,
and so good evening to all of the listeners out there on Isaac Radio.
And thank you again, David. You're a permanent staple here on the Citizens Community Forum, so I don't think you need much, introduction as it were. But we want to discuss some very important matters this evening, David, as it relates to Tobago. And I want to, pose one of the first questions to you, David. Many are still asking what really happened on December 6th. In Tobago.
Well, in a word, it was a blowout. The PNM suffered a tremendous defeat, a huge defeat, and the PDP scored a huge victory. And of course, but that's just identifying the 14-1. In additional quantitative terms, when you compare the January elections, which ended, as you said earlier, in the 6-6 tie, the situation then was that the PDP did not win the popular vote. So the numbers of persons who came out to vote in January was smaller. There was some, I think 47% or 50% of the electorate came out to vote in January, whereas 57, I think, percent came out to vote in December. So you had an increase in the numbers of persons coming out to vote. And secondly, the PNM won the popular vote by somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 votes in January. But this time they lost the popular vote to the PDP. So the PDP got almost 5,000 more votes than the PNM in this election. So there was both an increase in the actual numbers of people coming out to vote, as well as a very significant increase in the numbers of people coming out to vote for the PDP. And that was an example, and as a manifestation of the momentum that the PDP took from January straight down into December, and so on. So that's a quantitative analysis.
Yes.
If I could back up a little bit,
Yes,
because you
certainly.
did say quite correctly that the PNM had 21 unbroken years of control of the Tobago House of Assembly, and
Yes.
that is absolutely correct. It's very interesting because prior to that, the Democratic Action Congress, led then by Mr. A.N.R. Robinson, won the first THA elections. I think it was around 1980 or thereabouts.
That was another historic event as well, but go ahead.
It was. That was the first time that the House of Assembly was reestablished after the annexation or the joining of Trinidad with Tobago, or Tobago with Trinidad under the British colonial rule. So when the THA was reestablished, Dr. Williams was Prime Minister at the time, but Mr. Robinson's party was the Democratic Action Congress. He had 2 seats in the parliament. They won the 2 Tobago seats, East and West, in the 1976 elections, and then put pressure on the government to reestablish the THA, which happened, and he became the first chairman of the THA. So the DAC, and then after the DAC
that was
folded
the
up.
Democratic Action Congress?
That is correct, yes.
Right.
And after the DAC folded up in 1986 to be part of the National Alliance for Reconstruction, the NER continued to win in Tobago in the THA, so that the PNM was out of control of the THA from its inception all the way up to 2001. Yes? So you had a 20-year period when the PNM could not win in the THA. In fact, at one time, the PNM only had 1 seat, like they have again now. Yes? And so on. So there's always been, even before Mr. Robinson, but there's always been a body of the electorate in Tobago, concentrated primarily in Tobago East, that has not historically supported the PNM. And of course, this has fluctuated in terms of who could win the seats and so on, depending on the leadership in Tobago of the respective parties. Mr. Robinson had a certain stature. Mr. Ho Choi Charles continued that and so on. And you had other people who were there, Mr. Jeff Davidson and others.
Indeed.
And then, of course, you had Mr. London. So, over London for the PNM. And so these were major figures in Tobago that led their respective parties to control the THA. So what has clearly happened is that initial core section of the electorate that historically was never PNM, the PDP was able to capture that and build on it. The TOP had it for a period, that with Ashwa Jack, they had it for a brief period, but they couldn't hold it.
TOP, yes.
And Mr. Duke was able to capture that, and then Mr. Fali Augustine came in, and and so on. So that is one of the factors that resulted in that huge change. But there are many other factors. Of course, I'm not Tobagonian.
Yes,
and so yeah.
We'll seek to explore those other factors. So, yes. So David, is it a case of history repeating itself?
Yes, I think so. I think that, there obviously people want to change. I think, the media has interviewed a number of people.
About the one seat, that 1 seat that was, that one
yes,
seat.
Yes, it was. The PNM held 1 seat. Mr. William Mackenzie held that. In fact, I think he died not too long ago, just a few months ago, And Mr. William Mackenzie was a lone assemblyman in the THA for several terms of the THA, 2 or 3 terms. He was a lone assemblyman holding the fort for the PNM in the THA, and until they were able to gain more ground and more popular support, and as the support for Ho Choi Charles started to ebb, and so on, and with Mr. Robinson moving off the political stage, giving up his position as member of parliament and then becoming president, and therefore moving off the direct political stage, that support ebbed, and Mr. London was able to move in. What was also significant is that around that time that Mr. London came to the fore, the PNM changed its structure because they recognized that there was a very strong dislike by Tobagonians of any Port of Spain or Trinidad-centric party.
Central government, yes.
And the PNM was seen as Trinidad, yes. And so the PNM created what they now call the Tobago Island
And
Council of the
council,
PNM.
yes, yes.
One of the, and there's a political leader of that PNM Island Council. So within the PNM structure, they began to give a little bit more space and autonomy. And when Mr. Manning was Prime Minister, he not being Tobagonian, and Mr. London having a very high stature, Mr. London and the Tobago Council really made the PNM in some respects more connected with the identity of Tobago.
Yes, yes.
And somewhat less connected with the identity of Balize House and Port of Spain and Trinidad.
Right.
And I think that contributed to the PNM success, certainly in the early
21
period.
year, 21 year, yeah.
Certainly up until, I would say, the last few years, yes.
But of course, on you know,
but that
until
began
December 6th.
that began to, yes, but that also began to weaken some years ago, because of course the TOP did win the 2 Tobago parliamentary seats as part of the People's Partnership in 2010, and they won 4 seats in the Assembly in 2009 THA elections. I think it was 2009. So the PNM's control was beginning to be loosened before, but then they regained it, largely because of the TOP's very close identification with the UNC in Trinidad and with the partnership, and so
yes, well, we all know what happened there, and what were the sentiments on the ground in Tobago with respect to a possible UNC infiltration. But you know, that's a topic for another discussion. But you know, I just want to remind our listeners that this is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. Our topic this evening: future of Tobago, implications for the Twin Island state following December 6 election results. I have with me former government senator, political analyst, and leader of the Movement for Social Justice, David Abdullah. David, where does Tobago go from here? We have now, what, a 14-1 in terms of the, when we look at seats. One gets the sense, David, that it's not going to be, even though there is a 14 on one end and of course, you know, one, it's not going to be an easy ride. Where does Tobago go from here?
Yeah, well, the PDP with such a large victory got a significant mandate to do things very differently in terms of governance.
And that's where I'm heading, yes. Where do we go from here?
And also in terms of the economic model of development. So this 14-1 result opens up the possibilities for change, for significant change.
And
even
great
though,
expectations,
of course, the strictures of the existing, and great expectations, even though there are constraints based upon the existing legal framework. So the THA Act limits what the THA can do without central government and so on. But they do have space. I've heard them talk about greater accountability and transparency. Now, that is something that does not require central government approval. So how they manage their affairs, I think certainly they can bring people in. We talk, this forum is a citizens community forum, right? So they need to create citizens community spaces where people, because Tobago is a small community, or a series of small communities interrelated by family and so many other things. So they actually have the possibility, given the small size of Tobago, to get the views of Tobagonians and involve Tobagonians in decision making. So, for example, a budget, they have to prepare a budget because there was no budget for the current fiscal year by the THA because there was no assembly functioning.
Right.
So the central government allocated money, but there were no allocations by the THA in terms of how that money would be spent.
Because they couldn't decide. They couldn't decide on which way the THA was going to be managed. As we talk about that deadlock, that 6-6, coming out of that 6-6.
Correct. There was and there was a possibility of power sharing, and that was largely rejected by the
and that's something I want
to work against them.
And that's something that I want to talk with you about a little later on in the program. But go ahead. I would allow you to develop that point that you're making.
Yeah. So I think that this is now an opportunity for the PDP, quite apart from its manifesto, to engage the citizens in Tobago the people of Tobago in a discussion about the budget. So to do a popular process of budgeting rather than the top-down thing where the Secretary of Finance simply comes and reads out a budget. I think there's a possibility of doing something different there. And so it's not just about accountability and transparency, but also beginning to involve more people in the process of decision making. And that would change that lends itself to a real changes in governance culture. The culture of governance could be different. A second key thing in terms of governance, obviously, is the Tobago autonomy arrangement.
Oh, yes, yes.
Because the autonomy bill is in the parliament. It was debated. The opposition said it was not supporting it. The opposition did not articulate any of its own view of what should be contained in it. But I do think now the Tobago has a strong voice through the PDP with that 14-1 mandate to say to the parliament, not just the PNM, but to both parties in the parliament. This is the form.
Yes.
That's right. This is the form of the autonomy that we wish to have. And so that is a major development that is possible. Now, how the parliamentary parties respond to what is put forward by the PDP is going to be another matter. And certainly there'll be negotiations and discussions and so on. But that is something that we have to, because, you know, well, I wouldn't say horse trading, but there'll be a lot of politicking.
Because,
the UNC might...
Because you know this business of politics, David. I mean, you've been in this business for quite some time, and you know, you have a sense of what happens. You know, I remember A.N.R. Robinson talking about a party of parties, talking about, you know, where I mean, even there was even the famous quote, you know, politics having a morality of its own.
Yeah. Well, you know, how I see that playing out is that the UNC will simply support whatever the PDP proposes, you know, because they're looking at some possible alliance. You know, I'm not saying that will happen, but that is how the UNC will calculate it. That if they support the PDP on that, I scratch your back on supporting autonomy, what you propose for autonomy, you scratch my back in 2025 or whenever the next general elections are held, and so on, and we could form a government together. That is how I see the UNC. That's how they calculate their politics, right? It's not based on principle to say this is what they stand for. It is based purely on maneuvering. Okay, the PNM's position is going to, but that the UNC's position by itself will not enable the legislation to pass. It will require a special majority, which means that the PNM has to be on board.
Yes.
Now, the PNM will therefore not want to alienate Tobago in a very significant way.
Any further, yeah.
That's right. Any further, correct. Because that will worsen their chances in the parliamentary elections of 2025. So the PNM is going to have to play a balancing act in that regard. And where the PDP, how the PDP plays its cards is going to be very interesting. So it's going to be a very dynamic period of discussion around Tobago autonomy. But it also requires a discussion here in Trinidad. Because if, for example, just to quote one arrangement, if, for example, the push is for a federal system where there's a federation and so on, where Tobago has a Tobago parliament, does that mean that Trinidad wants to have its own parliament, quite apart from a Trinidad and Tobago parliament?
As you said, David, you know, just stick a pin there. Is that a similar type of arrangement? I'm looking at St. Kitts Nevis. I'm trying to remember if there was a similar type of federation type of arrangement that was fostered. Correct me if I'm wrong here. I'm looking at the picture in the, you know, around the Caribbean, and whether we had a similar model.
Yeah, I think St. Kitts comes closest to that, but there is no separate St. Kitts Parliament and Nevis Parliament and then a federal parliament. But there is a federal arrangement. What is also interesting is, say, the UK model, because there is a Scottish Parliament which has legislative power. There is a Parliament there's a Welsh Parliament which has legislative power, and then of course, but there's no British Parliament. There's no English Parliament. there's a parliament of the United Kingdom, yes, which is the national government.
Yeah.
But there's a certain devolution of power to the respective Scottish and Welsh parliaments and so on. So there are different models that one could look at, and we would have to see what this is where the negotiations have to take place.
Yes, indeed.
And where the politics comes in, and one hopes it is the politics of principle and so on, and not the politics purely of opportunism. Excuse me.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Not the politics of hate, not one of, divisiveness, not one that would seek to, go against, democratic principles and so I sense, I have a view as to where you're going in terms of, the arrangement. But again, we want to remind our listeners and our viewers that this is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. Our topic this evening, future of Tobago, implications for the Twin Island state following December 6th election results. And I have with me former government senator, a political analyst and leader of the movement for social justice, David Abdullah. David, was there a misreading of the electorate? Now, I at the beginning, I sense that you hinted that there was probably something of a similar nature, but I wanted to just, wanted you to expand a little further on that. Was there a misreading of the electorate on the part of the PNM this time around? I'm hearing where some people are saying that they went with the same playbook that was used in the last election.
Yes, I think so. I mean, many people, including Tobagonians who are commentators, have said that they expected the PDP to win. And my own feedback, we had one or two. We have some members in the MSA from Tobago, and the feedback was that the PDP would win. But I don't think anybody expected the size of the victory.
So wide a margin.
I don't think that was expected. But as such a wide margin, yes. But I think that the PNM did misread in several respects. One is, and I picked that up since January, even before the elections in January, that the way in which the PNM treated its own, in other words, when Mr. Kelvin Charles was removed as political leader of the PNM Island Council and replaced by Tracy Davidson Celestin, that was very messy, and I think a lot of Tobagonians did not appreciate that. And then he was pushed out as chief secretary, yes, well before the end of the term. So he was really treated very badly. And I think people, even some PNM people, felt that was not a good thing. And then, of course, you had Mrs. Sawyer-Fat,
yes, Angus,
who contested the elections for the leadership of the PNM Island Council, lost, and then turned her support into support for Mrs. Yes, she then support. But before that, she supported Mrs. Davidson Celestin. You remember, so that Mr. Jack and Mrs. Sawyer-Fat Angus both then came together and supported Tracy Davidson Celestin, and that tipped the scale in favor of Mrs. Davidson Celestin over Mr. Kelvin Charles. Then Mrs. Sawyer-Fat Angus was shunted aside, and so on. And that is when she went.
It was another tipping,
independent, and later on formed the whole party.
The IDA, yes.
Yes. So I was getting the impression that within the PNM there was some dissatisfaction about the leadership.
Fracturing, yes. Because I wanted to,
and you're seeing that now.
Because we saw
resignations.
Right. Well, I was just about to make mention of that. We've seen what I believe there have been 2 resignations.
More than two.
Well, probably more than 2 now.
4. Yeah.
Okay. You're keeping count of the numbers, David. Certainly.
Yeah.
But when we look at this, I wanted to ask the question. And I started out by asking you about if there was a misreading. My question again is, or among several questions that I have, was it simply a political campaign that went wrong for the PNM? Did the PDP really gain the admiration of the people of Tobago, and so much so that that the mandate was given? And was it really a protest vote against a 21-year old PNM rule in Tobago? I mean,
all
3%
of
is
the
there,
above.
but
Yeah, all of the above, Stephen. In other words, there was a mood for change. People had 21 years in the PNM, so there was a mood for change. I think people were fed up of the governance style of the PNM in the THA and of Dr. Rowley as Prime Minister and his interface with Tobago. So I think that also turned people off. I think that there was a lot of popular support for Mr. Fadi Augustine. He came across as a very down-to-earth young man who had Tobago at heart, and his leadership style and so on resonated, and his language and his articulation of the aspirations of Tobagonians, I think resonated. I think that was very powerful. Yes. And I also think that the Tobago centricity of the PDP, that the PDP was really focused on Tobago, and people saw the PNM more and more as being that Tobago type party that Orville London had kind of built. I think that was also another factor. So that there was a strong Tobago sentiment this time around. I also think that the PNM's, well, I could only judge from, because I was, of course, we're not on the ground in Tobago, but the advertising strategy or campaign by the PNM was they were running constantly on television. May work for a Trinidad audience,
right?
Yes, but not necessarily for Tobago audience.
And that was another question I wanted to pose to you about, that what some people call that ground campaign. That was not reflected largely. Some analysts would tell you was not reflected largely in the campaign that the PNM ran.
Yes, so that obviously the PDP was on the ground, doing the face-to-face, and in a small community, if you have candidates who are well known in the community, well connected, that gives you a huge starter. Yes, and if they were working the ground consistently, that would work for them. And I think that certainly the very expensive advertising campaign, radio ads, constant radio ads, television ads, and so on, demonizing Fadi Augustine and Watson Duke, I don't think that helped the PNM. I think that worked against the PNM. Yes, I don't think that people liked that type of campaigning because, particularly in Tobago, where because people know one another, they went to school with one another, their family connections and so on. So if you demonize Stephen, then a whole set of people don't like that because a whole set of people connected to Stephen and then we are the other, and they have to live with Stephen, after election is over. So I don't think that advertising campaign, I don't know who came up with it. That might work in a Trinidad context of UNC
not
versus PNM.
Not necessarily in
but
Tobago.
Not in Tobago.
All right,
no,
all right.
no.
I hear you, David. Well, this is the Citizens Community Forum. Stephen Cummings. Our topic this evening: future of Tobago, implications for the Twin Islands state following December 6 election results. I have with me a former government senator, political analyst, and leader of the movement for social justice. David, we have to take a short break, and when we come back, we will continue the discussion. Be part of the Citizens Community Forum, a place where we bring to light and discuss critical community, social and national issues, discussions on health, leadership, governance, crime, education and social justice.
We might shift from focusing on whole language approaches to focusing on developing phonemic awareness. So we're just teaching phonics, and then the role of comprehension, the vocabulary development, making sure students can visualize when they read. We're not addressing those needs. So you're right.
And as a matter of fact, I don't know, Stephen, if you know this, but there are some places in the States where the legal drinking age is 21 and not 18. Even though there are persons advocating for our age of consent to be dropped back to 16.
You are dealing with developmental stages of learning. Should it start at the primary, secondary? Where should it start?
Very, very good question.
So there are studies that are being done. The thing about it, Mr. Cummings, let's be honest, how many people really sit and read those studies, or even, I mean, a lot of things are coming in different forms. A lot of the data, a lot of the research is coming in video forms and so on. In our own society, how has research been articulated on this pandemic?
Every Wednesday, 8 to 9 p.m., the Citizens Community Forum. Your host, Stephen Cummings.
Welcome back to the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. This evening we are focusing on Tobago. Our topic, future of Tobago, implications for the Twin Islands state following December 6 election results. And I have with me former government senator, political analyst and leader of the Movement for Social Justice, David Abdullah. David, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again, Stephen. Great conversation.
Yes, indeed. Again, I want to sort of, just stay on that point about the campaign that we saw, in Tobago, both from, the side of the PNM and the side of the PDP, and as well as other political parties. Our good friend, political analyst, Derek Ramsamouj, who I know you're very familiar with, David, also had a perspective on that very same issue of the campaign, and I want us to just get a listen as well, as he also had a perspective on the kind of campaign that we saw in Tobago, that well, I suppose leading up to December 6th. So let's just get a listen to Derek Ramsamouj. Pull that back so that you can just get a better sense as to what Derek Ramsamouj has said. Let's take that from the top again. Hopefully we can get that queued up. Let's see if we can get that again.
An 11% drop from 50% the PNM got in January to 41% of the voter turnout. So it signals a form of rejection of the PNM in its hardcore constituency, and it must be taken seriously, because if that behavior were to be extended to Trinidad in certain constituencies like Toco, like Moruga Tablan, like La Hokata Talparo, there would be a political consequence to the PNM's capacity to win the election if there is not a rethink of its politics. If you look, the other issue coming up is the notion of the PDP's governance. Clearly, from the campaign messages, we will see the continuation of patronage. There are a number of promises made, that of more money, that of improving the quality of life by state patronage to individuals. So we don't expect anything substantially different with the governance of Tobago, save and except the distribution of wealth. What is interesting is whether or not there is going to be any seriousness towards that of further autonomy for Tobago. And that, I think, will be clearly identified in the coming months as to whether they're serious or whether that's political rhetoric. The immediate problem is going to be that of the COVID crisis and that of financial management and negotiations between Farley and Watson-Duke and the THA and the Prime Minister. So the question of whether there's going to be a difference between political rhetoric of supporting Tobago or political vengeance, that is indeed probable.
All right, David, I hope that was audible.
Yes, it was.
Right, yes. But I mean, he spoke about a number of things there, David. One of the things he mentioned was that, echoing that point that you made a little earlier on about, having to treat with that very delicate, situation between, central government and the THA. He also mentioned that one of the first things that would have to be dealt with from Tobago, under the THA as they manage their business is that of the COVID crisis. But I'd want you to sort of expand or probably just comment further on what Ramsey would have said.
Yeah, so I mean I agree with what Derek has said. I think all his points are correct. I didn't mention the COVID management. I think that is crucial. I think Mr. Faliagas, the new Chief Secretary, has sent the right signals. Even, for example, he got married over the weekend and he said he didn't want a lot of people to come to his wedding. You know, the culture of Tobago and a Tobago wedding is everybody comes, right?
Yeah, the entire community of Tobago, yes.
Yeah, and he had to manage that because of COVID. So I think he sent the right signal there. And they've identified the health secretary, who is someone who has some knowledge of public health matters. So the management within Tobago, I think, is going to be very important going forward, as it is in Trinidad, and whether they can be more persuasive in Tobago, getting more people vaccinated. I think that will be a tremendous challenge. And if they're successful, it would mean that their communication strategy is better than the PNM government has been nationally as a whole. So I think that's going to be an important test.
Yes.
The other major issue is going to be the management of the economy.
Indeed.
And whether there can be a new economic model. Now, I mentioned the participatory process in decision making, but they have in their manifesto identified a somewhat different approach. In other words, rather than the mega hotel type thing, the Sandals type project,
yes,
which ran into a lot of
problems. With that. Yeah, certainly.
They are proposing smaller hotels, boutique hotels, and so on. So it's going to be interesting to see how they roll out their economic program so that the benefits of economic activity in Tobago could be more equitably shared. And you could have more,
Yeah, that also raises the question of political patronage, David. Whether that might rear its head under this new Tobago administration, because that has always been an issue as well.
It has been a major problem in Tobago, as it has been in Trinidad. But certainly in Tobago, the THA has been so dominant in the economic space of Tobago, so that a very large percentage of the labor force, the majority of the labor force in Tobago, is in fact employed under the THA, and therefore how they manage the labor market issues in terms of the private sector, encouraging more people to get into self-employment, maybe cooperative activities and so on.
Yes.
All of that is going to be very interesting going forward. And if the PDP can develop a different model of economic development for Tobago, I think that will point to directions that are very positive for Trinidad as well, and abandon what we call the neoliberal model as well, which is one of allowing a few private sector people to maximize all the benefits at the expense of the many. So it's going to be interesting. So governance, in terms of more participatory democracy, COVID management, and the issue of the economic model of development. Those are the three things that they're going to be tested on going forward, and delivering on some of their promises to their supporters.
Yes,
that is also going to be a big challenge, because there's a limit to the resources of the THA.
Certainly,
and therefore how they use those resources,
and especially a THA that is so dependent on central government.
Yes, correct. But of course, there is a.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but there is a minimum amount that the THA must get under the existing arrangements between Trinidad and Tobago. which was set by the arbitration tribunal many years ago, or the dispute resolution committee many years ago, where Tobago must get a certain percentage of the national budget. So even if the central government does not want to give them a lot more, they know that they must get at least that minimum amount.
Right.
And if they can use it well and avoid mismanagement of funds, corruption, and so on, which they accused the last government or the last THA administration of carrying out, if they could do that, then they may have the kind of resources to do some interesting things. Already they have been given approval, that was a previous THA, and therefore that should not be reined in, to raise additional funding for their capital projects by way of bonds and so on, bond financing, so that they also have additional sources of funding outside that of central government direct subventions.
Right, so that there are ways, I suppose, that they can go towards raising finances and outside of the central government allocation, which comes, which by law, has to be given to the THA. There are other ways you're saying that they can go about it, but you see, again, going back to this autonomy bill and the self-governance issue that we've been talking about, David, one wonders, even in this, in their term, whether there can be any kind of realization of Tobago really getting the kinds of autonomy because we've been talking about autonomy since the time of A&I Robinson. I remember. Is it that this?
Yes, and it's been a step-by-step process. In other words, Robinson was able to get a limited amount with the first THA Act, and then there were amendments to that Act sometime in the 90s, I think, late 80s, 90s. There was an amendment to that, so that there were some greater powers given to the THA, and so it's been a step-by-step process. And I think this is now the moment when we ought to be able to conclude definitively on Tobago autonomy. This is going to be the moment.
Yes, decades of discussion and parliamentary debates and significant.
Yeah, and significantly, the partnership failed to do that in between 2010 and 2015 because the partnership had the required majority in the parliament to pass the amendments, and they had 2 Tobago seats. So they ought to have done that then, but that didn't happen. So, the UNC can't really absolve themselves of the failure to give Tobago more autonomy when they were in government.
Yeah. David, why is this taking so long? Let me press the point again. Why has this autonomy bill been, dragging its snail pace through the different, administrations over the several decades? We've also had several, hundreds of consultations over the many decades. Even in Tobago, there have been consultation on this very same topic. Business people were able to express their views, the business sector, various sectors, you would find there being reflected in terms of their views and what they would like to see for Tobago in that particular document. And one asks the question again, why is it that it continues to be to be so much of an issue that I suppose that may have probably been one of the factors as well that reflected itself on December 6th.
Yes, and I would say there are 2 reasons for that, Stephen. One is that there may not have been consensus or agreement even within Tobago on what form autonomy should take.
Even the widespread after the widespread consultation that even over London,
right. So that is the only moment when it seemed that there was consensus that emerged when Mr. London initiated, and that was what came down to Trinidad as a draft bill. It went to the Parliament and then into the Joint Select Committee, and then the PNM came back with a a variation of that, and that variation was what was debated in the Parliament earlier this year. So it was only relatively recently that there may have been consensus, some level of consensus in Tobago as to what form that autonomy should take. And I'm not even saying there was absolute consensus, but there would have been some measure of consensus amongst the contesting political parties and different stakeholders, interest groups in Tobago. And so that was one factor. The second factor, obviously, is what are the views of the parliamentary parties in Trinidad on the question of autonomy.
Yes.
Because the parliamentary parties in Trinidad see their role either as being in control of central government, or they were in control and want to get back in control of central government. And therefore, they perceive their interests as maintaining a certain amount of control over Tobago. Yes? Because that is what the nature of central governments are like. They want to maintain control not only over Trinidad, but over Tobago. And therefore, they will be less inclined to give the type of autonomy that Tobagonians really want to have to Tobago.
Okay.
Now, it's not only peculiar to Tobago autonomy, it also applies to local government in Trinidad, where there have been umpteen white papers, green papers, consultations
on local government,
draft legislation for local government reform in Trinidad. Hasn't happened. The last significant local government reform took place during the NER period, around 1991 or thereabouts, and we haven't had any since. And again, the partnership contested on bringing about significant local government reform, and that didn't happen either. All it did was to add a different process for electing aldermen for corporations, but nothing else. So central government always, in our political culture, which political culture wants to centralize power in the hands of the executive, namely the cabinet, and by extension, the prime minister, because the prime minister controls the cabinet and controls the parliament. So central government does not like relinquishing power in our political culture. Does not like relinquishing power to local government or to Tobago. And so the Tobago autonomy, like local government, is up against that political culture of centralized power and control.
And I suppose that's something that we may stay with us for quite some time as well, because you don't just get up overnight and change a system that has been working in the favor of some people, whether it be incumbent or what have you, for so many decades. So I suppose it will take some time for that culture that you talked about, David, to really change. And well, we also like to remind our listeners and our viewers that this is the Citizens Community Forum. I'm Stephen Cummings. Our topic this evening: future of Tobago, implications for the Twin Islands state following December 6th election results. David, we have just a few minutes before we end the program this evening, but before we go, I wanted us to just get a listen again to Derek Ramsamouj. He had also a perspective on this very same topic of self-government for Tobago. Let's get a listen again as we close the program in just a few minutes.
If you look at what composed of the PDP voters, you had a number of major players who contributed to the THA Act, going way back from Post Robinson to that of Hochoy Charles and these individuals. If you look at the political trends, we saw what happened in the United Kingdom, where there was the breakup of the kingdoms between Scotland, who's looking for its referendum, as well as Wales. So one would expect continued dialogue as to the method of how Tobago gets greater autonomy. The question is, would the THA and the legislative framework, would they be willing to look at basically creating a national referendum between Trinidad and Tobago to see if that has any sort of credence? While it is good political rhetoric, the mechanisms for disaggregating Tobago from Trinidad is a very complicated one, and would take not a couple months, but quite a couple years, more than one term, to begin to strengthen that autonomy away from each other. But I don't think the issue is going to be independence, because there are a number of economic and financial considerations, as well as the psychology between the Tobagonians and the Trinidadians. And are we going to disaggregate the unitary state? Highly unlikely in the short term.
David, some comments again from Derek Ramsamouj.
Yes. Yes, and I agree. I mean, I don't think that the PDP is pushing for independence. I don't think that is what it is. And so that issue would not rise. In other words, when Scotland had its referendum, 1-on-1, it was really about Scottish independence, a complete breakaway from the United Kingdom. That is not what I understand to be the position in Tobago right now of the PDP. So I don't see the need for a referendum. But I do believe that we need to have a clear articulation of the PDP's position on autonomy,
direction, yes,
because they were not, yes, they were not part of that Orville London brokered consensus, as far as I'm aware, right? Although there may be persons who support the PDP or are close to PDP who are part of that process, but I don't know that they, as a party, were part of that consensus. So we need to hear directly from the PDP what its position is on the Orville London crafted bill that came down to Trinidad, and on what was presented by the PNM from the Joint Select Committee to the Parliament earlier this year. And so it's going to be very interesting. Let me just leave it like that. And we could maybe end on this note.
Yes.
It's going to be very interesting times ahead for Tobago and for Trinidad. And the possibilities for change exist in Tobago, and those possibilities have implications for Trinidad, not only in terms of the arrangement between Trinidad and Tobago, but also in terms of Trinidad politics and the politics of Trinidad and Tobago more generally.
Indeed. Yeah, but before you go, David, the Movement for Social Justice, MSJ, is it that you know, we will also be seeing maybe some greater efforts towards you know, representative politics in Tobago, because I know that you know, the MSJ has not really been. I suppose people have been, you know, asking what is the position of the MSJ as well with respect to Tobago, because you would want to be presented obviously as a national party.
Yes, but I think we also have to be very sensitive about the Tobago culture. And you know, while we do have members in Tobago, we haven't done any real political work in Tobago, and we have to be respectful of the situation, and to give PDP the space at this point in time to see what they can do in terms of the possibilities for change in Tobago, and obviously, you know, we will make our own ideas known and make our own contributions to that process.
Right, because I'm sure that the question, if it, you know, hasn't come as yet, David, it will come, that, you know, we'd want to leave it there for now. We want to leave it there for now, but I thought it was important to...
Let's leave it there for now, yes. Let's leave it there for now.
To bring that
yes,
question
I mean, I can't say that, yeah. I mean, I can't say that, you know, we are having, you know, education activities around the Tobago elections through our Tuesday talk with the MSJ, looking at the situation in Tobago and the possibilities for change with Tobagonians, leading Tobagonians, discussing both governance and economics and so on. So it is not that we are isolated, but at the same time, we have to respect Tobago and the politics of Tobago. And, you know, let me just, I sent a media release congratulating the
yes, I saw that
historic victory. I said it out the day after the elections, and congratulating Mr. Fali Augustine and the PDP on their victory, and pointing to the possibilities for change.
All right, indeed.
So let's leave it there for the time.
I hope that wasn't
time will see how things develop.
I hope that wasn't too much of unfair question, David. I hope there wasn't too much of
no, not at all, not at all.
Okay,
not at all.
But again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us once again inside the Citizens Community Forum. And as always, David, we will continue the discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me, Stephen. Been great, as usual, being on your program. Have a very good evening to all your listeners, and be safe. And let me wish everyone a very peaceful and safe and happy Christmas. In spite of all the difficult circumstances, we are into the Christmas season.
Yes.
And so let us put the focus and emphasis at this time on the significance of the celebration of Christmas,
yes,
which is, of course, the birth of the Christ child.
Thank you again, David.
Thank you.
The political leader there of the Movement for Social Justice, David Abdullah, on the Citizens Community Forum this evening, discussing the business of Tobago. Our topic this evening, future of Tobago, implications for the Twin Island state following the December 6th election results. I'm Stephen Cummings. Well, this has been the Citizens Community Forum for this evening. See you next Wednesday. It was a famous poet who once said, "They came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Words there from famous poet Martin Niemöller, 1892 to 1984.